Welcome to Ecology Matters, a podcast from the Ecological Society of Australia, featuring ecologists from all over the country.
The biodiversity in this part of the world is just incredible.
It's not just ice and snow, it's teeming with life on the coast.
I see that and I say, okay, well, that's a great opportunity to study it more.
Looking at those sites gives you a sense of joy and hope.
Love being around, it's incredible what we're doing now.
It's just, it's a really awesome program, and it's just so healing, like, for our whole community.
It's the beauty of ecology is that it's so interconnected.
Yeah, it's been really exciting actually.
We've known for decades that plastic pollution impacts on marine life. We know that species like the Australian fur seal are heavily affected, and yet there are many questions we don't have answers to. Adam Yaney-Keller is attempting to answer those questions in his PhD with Monash University and Phillip Island Nature Parks. Could you describe the kind of debris that you're finding has an impact on Australian fur seals?
Yeah. So really we've seen a whole gambit of types of debris out there. The majority of materials affecting the Australian fur seals, especially at the Seal Rocks colony, seems to be fishing material, and specifically at the moment, recreational fishing material. So large gauge fishing line. We've seen pups entangled with like a whole pole attached to lines, so they've clearly just pulled it out of somebody's hand. But on our last trip and the trip before that, actually, we've got pups out of hats. So it can really be anything. So like a ball cap that has degraded. So over time, as the sort of fabric parts of that sort of degrade, the pups will stick their head into the little loops that made. So it's not even something that you always realize is going to be an entangling material, something classical like that, fishing line. But yeah, they can be caught in just about anything.
What kind of impact are you seeing on the seals themselves?
Yeah, so it's, from just like a visual or body condition assessment, you can see sometimes the entanglements are somewhat loose and they're sort of just on there, but then they can be anywhere up to cutting severely into the neck, causing massive lacerations and wounds. On one trip, there was a fishing hook, unfortunately lodged in an eye. They really horrific wounds. And often what happens is they get caught when they're young. So they're out exploring the environment and then they get caught in it. They can't get out and they bring it back. And this is when they're just learning to dive and go into the ocean. And then as they grow, the entanglement constricts around them. So they get bigger and the entanglement stays the same size because it's this plastic material. And it starts to just cut deeper and deeper into them. And first it sort of breaks the fur layer, and that might have some thermoregulatory issues for them, and we don't know. But later on, it can just cause open wounds. And yeah, eventually we believe, death. But we really don't know what some of the deeper physiological impacts are, so that's something I'm hoping to study.
I understand that more than half of pinniped species, so seals and sea lions and walruses, have been found entangled in marine debris, particularly Australian fur seals. Why are pinniped species so highly impacted?
I think it's twofold. I think it's a matter of the fact that they're quite curious. They're relatively small-bodied, right? And they can get quite large, but when they're young, they're kind of perfectly sized sometimes, maybe to stick their head into these plastic loops, into bands. They're curious animals. I mean, anyone that's been out to a seal colony can, or seen them around, can attest they're very curious. They like to come up. They like to investigate their environment, and that's a really beneficial trait for them as they kind of go out and explore their predators. They want to investigate. They want to see what's out there. But, in a world with plastic, we're sort of selecting against that trait. The environment is saturated with these plastic materials that they then go up and investigate and get caught in. And if it was something like seaweed, maybe they could get it off. But when it's these plastic materials, they just seem to get caught. I think it's also the fact that they're an animal that comes onto land as well as in the ocean. So they act as like an ecosystem sentinel. So we know that the plastic is out there, but other marine species that maybe stay in the water more, or we don't see quite as often, they're more cryptic, we're not going to know. But seals are this excellent study species for sort of studying these ecosystem effects. They come onto land in order to breed and rest, and then they go into the water to forage. So we're also able to see it more, and that makes them a really great study species for this problem.
You alluded there that you're focusing on Australian fur seals in your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit about what you're investigating?
Yeah, so it's threefold, I guess. Looking at so how can we better detect the entanglements themselves? So at the moment, the things like recreational fishing line are really hard to detect in some of our traditional methods of doing this. So at the moment, there's drone surveys going on through Phillip Island Nature Parks, who manages the Seal Rocks colony. So they do drone surveys of the colony during the breeding season in order to get an idea of how many pups and adults are out there. That's through a citizen science portal called Seal Spotter, which anybody can log on to and help out with, which is really cool. But it's very hard to detect the fishing line, which is this transparent sort of thin entanglement material, and we think it's really underestimated. So I'm hoping to use thermal imaging along with the drones in order to get a better idea of the entanglements out there, either through sort of when it breaks the fur, if that's causing more heat to dissipate, or maybe open wounds. We're still testing out a lot of these methods right now to see if we can use this new technology that's constantly improving. I mean, the rate of increase with these new pieces of tech is really fascinating. So we're using the new thermal imaging tech combined with the drones in order to sort of survey the colonies and see if we can, come up with a new method for detecting these hard to detect entanglements and get a better idea of the prevalence of entanglements on the Seal Rocks colony. So that's sort of part one. Part two is going to be actually going out to the colony and catching entangled seals, and then taking samples of their blood, assessing their body condition, viewing their behavior, and seeing sort of what are the physiological effects that could be affecting their growth, reproduction, their immune response. Are they more susceptible to disease? These are all really important questions that at the moment there's really very little research on. We don't really know how bad these entanglements are, sort of on a sub-lethal level, and what effect that might have long-term down the road for them. So we're going to match those seals that are entangled. We're going to take the entanglements off, of course, but also then catch non-entangled animals of the same age, sex class, body condition, and try to match. And so do like a matched pair comparison and be able to say, okay, for the same population at the same point in time, how are these entangled individuals, how do they compare to ones that aren't entangled? And then we're going to be putting tracking devices on them that are going to sort of look at really fine scale bits of their behavior through accelerometers and time depth recorders, and also some GPS locations to see sort of after we take the entanglements off. This is a common practice for rescue, but we don't really know a lot about what happens to them after we just let them go into the environment. So we want to track their behavior over time and see how do they recover, but also how has it affected their foraging. Maybe when these young seals are being entangled, it's really affecting their ability to learn to dive and to develop those blood oxygen stores that are so important for a deep diving, apex predator like an Australian fur seal. So that's another aspect of this. We want to understand, what are the behavioral aspects, and then track their survival and reproduction over time by sort of going back to the colony and looking for them. Then the sort of final aspect of this, somewhat ambitiously, is to use those GPS tracks and that previous tracking data we have for this species in this colony and try and overlay it with maps of known fishing activity, plastic particle sort of drift maps. So these are models that exist out there. So we can kind of see where the seals are going and where the plastic might be and other types of marine debris, and say, okay, where are they overlapping? And are those areas that maybe we can target for reaching out to fishers, reaching out to policy makers, and trying to make some management actions to actually prevent the entanglements from happening in the first place. So all really exciting stuff.
I'm interested in hearing you say that there's so much that we don't know still. It interests me because from my understanding, marine debris has been listed as a key threatening process for marine vertebrates for 20 years now. Particularly when we're talking about a species like the Australian fur seal, which is widely loved. You know, we talk about charismatic megafauna and the fur seal would surely be included in that group. Why do you think that is, that this problem hasn't been looked at in depth before now?
I think there's an aspect of it where we say, you know, it's a welfare issue. You know, as ecologists, we're often trained to think on sort of a grand population scale. And a lot of studies haven't really been able to show conclusively that there is a population impact, yes or no. And the ones that have, you know, there are other studies that seem to show that populations sort of either kind of stay stable or decline, even if they have high rates of entanglement. So the science out there is somewhat inconclusive, but as a PhD student, I see that and I say, okay, well, that's a great opportunity to study it more. The fact that it's inconclusive in these sort of, you know, some populations seem to be able to persist with it. Some populations, it may decline. I mean, when you have a problem like that, it's often quite hard to, you know, pinpoint an exact cause or decline. But entanglement's one of many, you know, factors that are going to be affecting a wild population. And it's not just that, you know, entanglement may kill X amount of individuals, and the number is high. I mean, even if, you know, a population prevalence of entanglement is, say, 0.3%, for Australian fur seals, that's on Seal Rocks, that's 60 animals at any given time. For the entire population of 120,000 seals, I mean, that's hundreds of seals at any given time. It's a pretty horrific welfare issue that's out there. But it also means that the animals that are being affected are the young pups and things like that. So I think the fact that we also can't detect it very well, it's happening out in the ocean, it's happening on these offshore islands. You know, if a welfare issue like that was happening, you know, in our backyards, we'd have a lot to say about it. But because it's sort of out there and in the ocean, it's difficult to study. And I think it's just, what we're really seeing is just the tip of the iceberg in some ways. So many animals likely die and are never counted. And then the ones that we do see are, you know, often the strongest ones that can make it back. And it's an issue that affects animals over time. So as they grow and as these entanglements constrict them. So often we're able to study these populations, especially on, you know, difficult to study animals like Australian fur seals, which are, you know, their colonies are these offshore islands that can be quite hard to get through, and that makes the drone technology really promising. However, we're really able to see snapshots, you know, and you collect those snapshots over time and they tell you a story. But those stories take a long time to say. And when you're studying an issue that, you know, seems to be somewhat pervasive, but at these low levels, but they could have these outsized effects by affecting, you know, a really vulnerable age class, these in the first year of life of these animals. it just, these sort of persistent and pernicious effects may have long-term impacts that we really don't know.
Ecology Matters is a podcast by the Ecological Society of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting ecologists and ecological science in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To learn more about our work, follow us on social media, visit our website or sign up to our newsletter. You can find links to these in the show notes. The theme music is Glow by Scott Buckley. Lastly, thank you to all the ecologists who have taken part in this series and shared their perspectives on why ecology matters.